She stood alone at the graveside, the rain soaking her cheap black dress, while the wealthy elite of Connecticut whispered behind their gloved hands. To them, Sarah was nothing but a predator, a waitress who had clawed her way into the life of the Kensington heir just to secure a payout. His mother, the formidable Eleanor Kensington, had even spat at her feet moments before the casket was lowered, calling her a parasite in front of 50 witnesses. But what Eleanor didn't know was that the leather briefcase clutched in the lawyer's hand didn't contain a check for Sarah. It contained a secret that would destroy the Kensington legacy forever. When the will was finally read, nobody was looking at the gold digger anymore. They were looking at the mother in absolute horror. This is the story of how one piece of paper changed everything. The rain over Greenwich, Connecticut didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to wash the sin off the immaculate lawns of the Kensington estate. It was November 14th, 2023, a Tuesday that felt more like a Sunday morning hangover. Daniel Kensington, the 34-year-old heir to a shipping fortune that dated back to the Industrial Revolution, was being laid to rest in the family's private plot at St. Mary's Cemetery. Sarah Miller stood on the periphery of the gathering. She didn't have a chauffeured Mercedes or a designer umbrella. She held a drugstore umbrella that had already inverted once in the wind, struggling to keep her composure as she watched the mahogany casket descend into the wet earth. She was 28, wore no makeup, and her coat was a sensible wool blend she had bought at Macy's 3 years ago. To the sharks, gathered around the grave, her outfit screamed outsider. At the center of the funeral party stood Eleanor Kensington. At 62, Eleanor was a woman carved from ice and old money. She wore a vintage Chanel suit, black as a raven's wing, and her face was obscured by a lace veil that did little to hide the sneer she wore whenever her gaze drifted toward Sarah. "I can't believe she actually showed up," whispered Beatrice Caldwell, Eleanor's sister, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. The audacity. Daniel hasn't been cold for 3 days, and she's already here to sniff out the inheritance. "She won't get a dime if Eleanor has her way," replied a man in a gray trench coat, Thomas Sterling, a business partner of the late Daniel. "I heard Eleanor had the lawyers draft a block yesterday." Sarah heard them. She heard every word. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from a mixture of grief and rage that she had been suppressing for 72 hours. Daniel had died in a car accident on I-95, a sudden, brutal end to a life that had been far more complicated than anyone in this cemetery realized. As the priest, Father Michael O'Shea, finished the final commendation, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the tension in the air shifted from mournful to combative. The crowd began to disperse toward the waiting fleet of limousines. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to place the single white rose she had brought onto the coffin. She took a step forward. Her heel sank slightly into the mud. "Don't you dare!" a voice sliced through the rain. Sarah froze. Eleanor Kensington had broken away from her entourage and was marching toward her. The older woman's heels seemed immune to the mud, striking the ground with military precision. "Mrs. Kensington," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "I just wanted to say goodbye. You said your goodbyes when you drained his bank account to pay for your lifestyle," Eleanor hissed, stopping just inches from Sarah's face. The smell of expensive perfume and gin wafted off her. "My son is dead, and you are still standing here, looking for a handout. You are a gold digger, Sarah, a common, grasping little parasite." The chatter around the cars stopped. Drivers paused with doors open. All eyes were on the confrontation. "I loved him," Sarah said, clutching the rose so tight the thorns bit into her palm. "I didn't care about the money. I never asked him for anything." Eleanor let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Please, everyone knows. You were a barista. He was a Kensington. Do you think we're stupid? You charmed him, you isolated him, and now you think you're going to walk away with the family silver. Well, let me tell you something, Miss Miller. I have hired the best forensic accountants in New York. If you spent a single penny of Daniel's money on yourself, I will have you in prison before the grass grows on his grave." Sarah felt the tears hot in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She knew the truth about Daniel. She knew the truth about the fortune everyone thought existed. But this wasn't the place. Not here, over his body. "I'll see you at the reading, Eleanor," Sarah said quietly. "You aren't invited to the house," Eleanor snapped. "Actually, Mrs. Kensington," a deep, gravelly voice interrupted. Stepping out from behind a weeping willow was Robert Carlyle, the Kensington family attorney for over 40 years. He was a man who looked like he was made of parchment paper and tobacco smoke. He adjusted his spectacles, ignoring the rain spotting his suit. "Mr. Carlyle," Eleanor nodded, her demeanor softening only slightly. "Tell this girl to leave." "I cannot do that, Eleanor," Robert said, his tone professional but heavy. "My instructions were explicit. Sarah Miller is required to be present at the reading of the last will and testament, immediately following the service." Eleanor's face went pale, then red. "Required? By whom?" "By Daniel," Robert said. He held up a thick manila envelope, and he was quite specific. "If Miss Miller is not present, the will remains sealed, and the assets remain frozen indefinitely." The silence that followed was louder than the rain. Eleanor looked from the lawyer to Sarah, her eyes narrowing into slits. She looked like she wanted to scream, but a Kensington never screams in public. "Fine," Eleanor spat. "Let her come. Let her see exactly how little she's worth. Get in the third car, Sarah. Don't touch anything." Eleanor turned and swept away, her sister scrambling to hold an umbrella over her. Sarah stood there for a moment longer. She stepped forward, dropped the white rose onto the wet wood of the coffin, and whispered, "I promise I'll fix it, Daniel. I won't let her win." She turned to the lawyer, Robert Carlyle. He gave her a look that was unreadable, not pity, not malice, just a strange, heavy solemnity. "Ready, Miss Miller?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she replied. The Kensington estate, known locally as the Gables, was a sprawling neo-Gothic mansion sitting on 4 acres of prime coastal land. It was the kind of house that had a name, a gate code, and a history of hiding family secrets. The interior was all dark wood, velvet drapes, and portraits of ancestors who looked like they judged you for breathing their air. Sarah had been here only 3 times before. Each time, Daniel had smuggled her in through the side entrance to avoid his mother. Today, she walked through the front double doors, flanked by Robert Carlyle. The library was prepared for the reading. It was a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig. A fire was crackling, but the room felt freezing. About 12 people were gathered. There was Eleanor, sitting in a high-backed wing chair, like a queen on a throne. Beside her was Beatrice, her sister. Then there were a few cousins, Julian and Pierce, who spent most of their time skiing in Aspen and waiting for relatives to die. And in the corner, looking uncomfortable, was Daniel's younger brother, Christopher. Christopher was the only one who didn't look at Sarah with hatred. He looked tired. He offered Sarah a weak, apologetic smile as she entered, but quickly looked away when his mother cleared her throat. "Sit," Eleanor commanded, pointing to a small, wooden, stiff-backed chair set apart from the comfortable leather sofas the family occupied. Sarah sat. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She felt like Jane Eyre facing a firing squad. Robert Carlyle took his place at the heavy oak desk at the front of the room. He opened his briefcase with a distinct click-clack that echoed off the mahogany walls. He pulled out a document bound in blue ribbon. "We are gathered here to read the last will and testament of Daniel James Kensington," Robert began, his voice dry. "Dated October 2nd, 2023. Eleanor sat up straighter. "October? That's only a month ago. I thought his will was the one drafted in 2019. He updated it recently." "Eleanor," Robert said without looking up. "Quite extensively." A murmur went through the room. The cousins exchanged glances. An updated will usually meant trouble. "Let's get this over with." Eleanor waved a hand, dismissively. "Read the part where he leaves the estate to me and the trust, and gives the girl a token sum to go away. $5,000, was it? Or perhaps he left her his used car." Beatrice snickered. Robert cleared his throat. I will read the will in its entirety. Please hold your comments until the end. He began with the standard legal jargon, revoking all previous wills. Then, he moved to the specific bequests. To my brother, Christopher, Robert read, I leave my collection of vintage guitars and the sum of $50,000, with the hope that you finally start that studio you always talked about. Don't let Mother talk you out of it. Christopher choked back a sob, putting his head in his hands. Eleanor rolled her eyes. Sentimental rubbish. Continue. To my cousins, Julian and Pierce, I leave the contents of my wine cellar. Drink it in good health, and perhaps try working a day in your lives. The cousins stiffened, offended, but kept quiet. The wine collection was worth a fortune, so they weren't complaining too loudly yet. To my Aunt Beatrice, Robert continued, I leave the antique vanity set that belonged to grandmother. Maybe looking in it will help you find a conscience. Beatrice gasped. Well, I never. Quiet, Eleanor snapped. She was leaning forward now, her knuckles white on the armrests. Get to the main assets, Robert. The house, the shipping shares, the liquid capital. Robert took a slow breath. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Eleanor, then shifted his gaze to Sarah. Sarah held her breath. She knew what was coming, but she didn't know how he had phrased it. Regarding the Kensington family estate at 44 Oak Ridge Drive, the investment portfolio, currently managed by Goldman Sachs, and the majority shareholder position in Kensington Logistics. The room went dead silent. The fire popped, sounding like a gunshot. I, Daniel Kensington, being of sound mind, hereby acknowledge that these assets have been the source of great contention and pride for my mother, Eleanor. Eleanor nodded, a smug smile returning to her lips. Exactly, pride. However, Robert read, his voice rising slightly, I also acknowledge that for the past 5 years, the lifestyle maintained by my mother and the upkeep of this estate has not been funded by Kensington Logistics. Eleanor's smile faltered. What? In fact, Robert continued, reading verbatim from the page, Kensington Logistics has been insolvent since 2018. The company is bankrupt. The accounts are empty. The family trust was drained by bad investments made by my mother, Eleanor, in an attempt to save the company without admitting failure. Lies! Eleanor shrieked, jumping to her feet. That is a lie! Robert, stop reading this filth! Sit down, Eleanor, Robert roared, slamming his hand on the desk. It was the first time anyone had ever seen the lawyer lose his temper. I am reading the legal testament of your son. You will listen. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. The cousins looked terrified. Bankrupt? Insolvent? If the money is gone, Christopher asked, his voice trembling, then how have we been living here? The staff? The parties? The cars? Robert looked at Sarah. The text continues, Robert said softly. The reason we have not lost the house, and the reason my mother has been able to maintain her illusion of wealth, is because of a private benefactor who has been injecting cash into the estate accounts monthly for the last 4 years. A benefactor who paid off the tax liens, a benefactor who paid the staff's salaries. Eleanor was shaking her head, mumbling, No, it was the investments offshore. That benefactor, Robert read, is Sarah Miller. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a vacuum. Every head turned slowly, mechanically, toward Sarah. She sat there, her hands still folded, her face pale but resolute. Sarah? Beatrice whispered, looking at the girl's cheap coat. But she's a waitress. She is a waitress, Robert corrected, looking at the document. But she is also the primary developer and patent holder of the Kestrel logistical algorithm, which she sold to Amazon 3 years ago for $42 million. Eleanor's eyes bulged. She looked at Sarah as if she were seeing an alien. She didn't want anyone to know, Robert read on, Daniel's words filling the room with a haunting finality. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not her money. She knew you, Mother. She knew you would only accept her if she was rich. So she pretended to be poor to see if you had a heart. You failed. And when I went broke, she saved us. She saved you, Mother. She paid for the roof over your head while you called her a gold digger. Sarah closed her eyes. A single tear finally escaped. Therefore, Robert concluded, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, which consists mostly of personal effects and sentimental items, to Sarah Miller. Furthermore, regarding the debt, Sarah Miller currently holds the mortgage on this house and the liens on the company. Effectively, she owns everything. Robert closed the folder. Mrs. Kensington, Robert said, removing his glasses. Technically, you are trespassing on Miss Miller's property, and considering how you treated her at the funeral, I wouldn't expect her to be a lenient landlord. Eleanor looked at Sarah. The arrogance was gone. The sneer was gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, perhaps to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Sarah stood up. The cheap chair scraped against the expensive floor. I don't want the house, Sarah said, her voice steady. I never did. She looked at Eleanor. But I do want the truth, and I'm not done. Robert, is there a part B? Robert hesitated. He looked at the family, then back at Sarah. He nodded slowly. Yes, Miss Miller, there is a part B, and it concerns the circumstances of the accident. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. Accident? What do you mean? Daniel didn't just lose control of his car, Sarah said, her eyes hardening. He was on the phone with someone. He was arguing. We have the call logs, Eleanor. The atmosphere in the library shifted from shock to a suffocating dread. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, casting long, skeletal shadows against the rows of leather-bound books. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the leaded glass windows like handfuls of gravel. Call logs? Eleanor whispered. Her voice, previously so commanding, was now thin and brittle. She looked around the room, seeking an ally, but finding only averted gazes. Even her sister, Beatrice, had scooted a few inches away on the sofa. Robert Carlyle reached back into his briefcase. He didn't pull out paper this time. He pulled out a small, silver flash drive and placed it deliberately on the desk. Daniel knew his life was becoming unsustainable, Robert said, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. He came to me 3 days before the accident. He was distraught. He told me that the pressure being placed on him to fix the family finances was pushing him to a breaking point. He authorized me to access his cloud backups in the event of his untimely death. Robert plugged the drive into a laptop on the desk. He turned the screen so the room could see, though the audio was what mattered. This recording, Robert explained, was recovered from the dashcam system of Daniel's Audi. It records audio inside the cabin. This is the last 10 minutes of his life. 7:42 p.m., I-95 North, just past the Stamford exit. Sarah stared at the floor. She had already heard this. It was the soundtrack of her nightmares for the past 3 days. But she knew the Kensingtons needed to hear it. They needed to know that the blood wasn't on the wet asphalt. It was on Eleanor's hands. Robert clicked play. The sound of rain and the hum of a high-performance engine filled the quiet library. The rhythmic thump-thump of windshield wipers set a grim tempo. Then, the car's Bluetooth ringtone chimed. Mother, Daniel's voice filled the room. He sounded exhausted. I told you, I'm driving. I don't care what you're doing, Daniel. Eleanor's voice boomed through the speakers. It was shrill, panicked, and vicious. Sterling called me. He says, the check for the gala venue bounced. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? The Astors are going to be there. The Vanderbilts. I told you the accounts were empty, Daniel shouted back, his voice cracking. I told you to cancel the gala. I told you we needed to sell the Hamptons property. We are not selling the beach house, Eleanor screamed. That is admitting defeat. You are the man of the house, Daniel. Fix it. Go to that girl, that waitress. You said she helps with rent. Squeeze her. Tell her you need a loan. Tell her you're in trouble with loan sharks. Make something up. In the library, Sarah lifted her head. She looked straight at Eleanor. Eleanor was trembling, her hand covering her mouth, her face a mask of horror. On the recording, Daniel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You want me to lie to Sarah? She's the only good thing in my life, Mother. She's the only one who loves me for me, not for the name on the credit card. She is a nobody, Eleanor retorted. And you are a Kensington. Use her, Daniel. If you don't come up with $50,000 by tomorrow morning, don't bother coming home. I'll change the locks. I'll tell everyone you've been gambling. I will ruin your reputation so thoroughly, you won't be able to get a job sweeping floors. You wouldn't, Daniel gasped. Try me, Eleanor hissed. Fix it, or you're dead to me. There was a moment of silence on the tape. Just the rain and the engine. I can't do this anymore, Daniel muttered to himself. I can't breathe. Then, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The sound of tires screeching on wet pavement. A horn blaring long and loud. The sickening crunch of metal on metal, the shattering of glass, and then static. Robert pressed stop. The silence in the library was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Christopher, Daniel's brother, stood up slowly. His face was wet with tears, his fists clenched at his sides. He walked over to where his mother sat. You, Christopher whispered. You did this. It was a figure of speech, Eleanor stammered, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. I didn't mean. I was just stressed, Christopher. You know how I get. I didn't know he was going to crash. You told him he was dead to you, Christopher shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You told him to scam Sarah. You drove him into that guardrail just as surely as if you'd grabbed the wheel. Christopher, sit down, Beatrice snapped, though she looked unsure of herself. Don't speak to your mother like that. She's not a mother, Christopher spat. She's a monster, Daniel was trying to tell me. Last week, he tried to tell me how bad it was. He said you were threatening him. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just stressed. He turned to Sarah. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Sarah nodded gently at him. I know you didn't, Chris. This is preposterous. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her skirt, trying to regain her composure. I was a grieving mother under pressure. People say things. That recording proves nothing legally. It's tragic, yes, but it's not a crime to argue with your son. She turned her glare on Sarah. And as for you, Eleanor sneered, regaining some of her venom. So what if you have money? So what if you bought the debt? You think that makes you one of us? You think that buys you class? You're still just the little girl who served coffee? You don't know the first thing about running an estate like this. You'll be bankrupt in a year. Sarah finally stood up again. She walked to the center of the room, standing between the family and the lawyer. She looked at the portraits of the ancestors on the wall, grim-faced captains of industry. You talk about class, Eleanor, Sarah said, her voice calm and even. You talk about legacy, but let's talk about what you actually did with the money, Sarah signaled to Robert. Part C, Sarah said. Robert nodded. Part C covers the forensic audit. Eleanor froze. Audit? What audit? The audit I ordered, Sarah said. When I bought the debt from the bank 3 years ago, I didn't just pay the bills. I gained access to the transaction history. Every check, every wire transfer, every credit card swipe for the last 10 years. Sarah walked closer to Eleanor. The older woman shrank back into her chair. I know about the Cayman accounts, Eleanor, Sarah said softly. I know about the fake charity, the Kensington Foundation for the Arts. I know you've been funneling money out of the company, claiming it was for charity, and using it to pay for your jewelry, your plastic surgery, and your gambling debts in Atlantic City. The cousins, Julian and Pierce, gasped in unison. The foundation? Julian asked. But we sit on the board. We signed off on those donations. Exactly, Sarah said, turning to them. Which means you're accomplices to fraud. Unless, of course, you didn't know where the money was really going? We didn't, Pierce shouted, jumping up. She just brought us papers to sign. She said it was for tax purposes. You cowards, Eleanor shrieked at them. I kept you in silk ties and imported cars. I did what I had to do. You embezzled nearly $4 million, Robert Carlyle interjected, reading from a new document. That's federal wire fraud, Eleanor. And since the company was technically insolvent and trading while bankrupt, that's also securities fraud. Eleanor looked around the room. Her empire was crumbling. Her family was looking at her like she was a leper. Her defenses were gone. "You can't prove it," she whispered. "I don't have to," Sarah said. "I already gave the files to the district attorney this morning." The color drained from Eleanor's face so completely she looked like a corpse. "You went to the police?" she rasped. "I went to the FBI," Sarah corrected, "because the amount you stole crosses state lines. They're very interested in the foundation. Apparently, using charity money to pay for a vacation home in Street Bart's is frowned upon." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, rising over the sound of the storm. They were getting closer. "No," Eleanor whimpered. "No, no, no. You can't do this. I am Eleanor Kensington. My grandfather built this town, and you destroyed his name," Sarah said. She felt no joy in this, no thrill of victory, just a deep, aching sadness for Daniel, who had died trying to protect this woman's lies. Sarah turned to the rest of the family. "I'm not a monster," she said. "I'm not going to throw everyone out on the street tonight. Christopher, the carriage house is yours. You can turn it into a studio. I'll sign the deed over to you next week. It's what Daniel wanted." Christopher looked at her, stunned. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," she said. "Just live a good life. That's all he wanted for you." She turned to the cousins, Julian and Pierce. They flinched. "You two," Sarah said. "You're young. You're able-bodied. You have degrees you've never used. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. I suggest you use that time to find jobs. Real ones." "30 days?" Julian stammered. "But where will we go?" "I hear Amazon is hiring," Sarah said, a dry smile touching her lips. "I used to work there. It builds character." Finally, she turned back to Eleanor. The sirens were now at the front gate. Blue and red lights flashed against the library windows, strobing through the rain. "And you, Eleanor," Sarah said, "you don't have 30 days. You don't even have 30 minutes." The front doors of the mansion burst open. The heavy thud of boots on hardwood echoed down the hallway. The staff, the butler, Mr. Henderson, and the maid, Maria, stood in the doorway of the library, looking terrified but also strangely vindicated. Eleanor had treated them like dirt for decades. 2 federal agents in windbreakers, marked FBI, entered the library, rain dripping from their shoulders. They were led by a stern-faced woman with a badge on her belt. "Eleanor Kensington?" the agent asked. Eleanor didn't stand. She couldn't. She slumped in her chair, a broken queen on a crumbling throne. "I want to call my lawyer," Eleanor whispered. "You can call him from the station," the agent said. "Eleanor Kensington, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Please stand up." "Robert!" Eleanor shrieked, looking at the family lawyer. "Do something! Stop them!" Robert Carlyle slowly packed his briefcase. He clicked the locks shut. "I'm afraid I can represent you no longer, Eleanor," he said calmly. "Conflict of interest. You see, I represent the estate, and you have been stealing from the estate. My duty is to the victim. My duty is to Sarah." The agents hauled Eleanor to her feet. She kicked and screamed, her Chanel suit twisting, her hair coming undone. It was a pathetic, ugly sight. As they dragged her out of the library, past the portrait of her late husband, she locked eyes with Sarah one last time. "You'll pay for this," Eleanor screamed. "You'll rot in hell, you gold-digging bitch." "I'm not the one going to a cell, Eleanor," Sarah said quietly. The agents marched her out. Beatrice followed, sobbing, asking the agents if she could bring Eleanor's medication. The cousins sat in stunned silence. Sarah walked over to the window. She watched as Eleanor was handcuffed and placed into the back of an unmarked SUV. The rain poured down on Eleanor's expertly coiffed hair, plastering it to her skull. The flashing lights illuminated the scene in harsh, staccato bursts. "Are you okay?" Christopher asked, coming up beside her. "No," Sarah admitted. "I'm not. I miss him." "He'd be proud of you," Christopher said. "He was terrified of her. He never could stand up to her. You did what he couldn't." "I didn't do it for me," Sarah said, fogging the glass with her breath. "I did it so he could finally rest. She can't hurt him anymore. She can't use his name anymore." Sarah turned away from the window. Mr. Carlyle? Yes, Miss Miller? The lawyer looked at her with newfound respect. Who else knew? Sarah asked. About the fraud. Eleanor couldn't have done it alone. She's not good with computers. She couldn't have hidden the digital trail of the charity funds by herself. Robert stiffened. He glanced at the cousins, then at the door. That, Robert said, is a very astute question. The algorithm I wrote, Sarah said, her voice sharpening. It looks for patterns in logistics, but money moves just like cargo. I ran the patterns on the estate's accounts last night. Eleanor was the face of the fraud. But there was a signature, a digital signature on the transfers. She looked directly at Thomas Sterling, the man in the gray trench coat who had been at the funeral, the business partner. He had been standing in the shadows of the library, near the bookshelves, silent throughout the entire ordeal. He had been trying to blend into the woodwork. Hello, Thomas, Sarah said. Thomas Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped out of the shadows. Smart girl, Thomas said. I told Daniel he shouldn't date a smart girl. The room seemed to shrink. The FBI agents had left with Eleanor. It was just the family, the lawyer, Sarah, and now Thomas Sterling, the CFO of Kensington Logistics. Thomas? Christopher asked, confused. What are you talking about? Your mother was greedy, Thomas said, walking casually toward the drinks cart and pouring himself a scotch. But she was also incompetent. She wanted the money to keep up appearances. I wanted the money to build something new. We had an arrangement. You cooked the books, Sarah said. You set up the shell companies. Eleanor just signed the checks. I did, Thomas admitted. He took a sip of the drink. And I did a damn good job of it. Until you showed up. Until Daniel started getting a conscience. Daniel found out, Sarah realized. That's why he was so desperate. It wasn't just the debt. He found out you were stealing. He came to me a week ago, Thomas said, swirling the amber liquid, threatened to go to the SEC. I told him that if he did, his mother would go to prison. He was torn. A classic, tragic hero. Couldn't save his mother without becoming a criminal. Couldn't save his soul without destroying his mother. You pressured him too, Sarah said, her hands balling into fists. It wasn't just Eleanor on that phone call. You called her right before. You wound her up. You told her the check bounced. I needed her to panic, Thomas shrugged. Panic makes people compliant. I needed her to force Daniel to sign off on one last transfer. A big one. $5 million. Enough for me to retire to a non-extradition country. You monster, Christopher lunged forward, but Julian held him back. Careful, boy, Thomas warned, reaching into his trench coat. He didn't pull out a gun, but he pulled out a thick stack of documents. I have leverage. Evidence that implicates the entire board. If I go down, the Kensington name is mud. Not just Eleanor, all of you. Even you, Christopher. You signed tax returns 3 years ago. Remember? Christopher went pale. So, Thomas smiled, here is what is going to happen. Sarah, you are going to forget about that little digital signature you found. You're going to let Eleanor take the fall. She's already arrested. She's the perfect scapegoat. I will walk away quietly. I'll leave the company to you. You can try to salvage it. And if I don't? Sarah asked. Then, I release these. Thomas tapped the documents. And I drag this whole family through a trial that will last 10 years. You might have money, Sarah, but do you have the stomach for that? Do you want Daniel's name dragged through the mud every day on CNN? Heir to crime family? Is that the legacy you want for him? It was a standoff. Thomas was betting on Sarah's love for Daniel's memory. He was betting that she wanted to protect his reputation more than she wanted justice. Sarah looked at the documents. She looked at Christopher, who was terrified. She looked at the portrait of Daniel on the mantel. She thought about the man she loved. He was kind, he was gentle, and he hated lies. He hated the pretense, the fake smiles, the hidden rot of his family's legacy. You're right about one thing, Thomas, Sarah said softly. Oh? Thomas raised an eyebrow. And what's that? I don't want a 10-year trial. Sarah pulled her phone out of her pocket. The screen was glowing, so I decided to live stream this, she said. Thomas froze. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. What? I'm on Instagram Live, Sarah said, turning the phone around. And YouTube, and Facebook. I have 42,000 followers from my tech days, but right now, I have about 200,000 viewers. It turns out, billionaire funeral drama is a trending topic. She walked closer to him, the camera lens pointed squarely at his face. Say hi to the world, Thomas, Sarah said. You just confessed to conspiracy, fraud, and blackmail in front of 200,000 witnesses, including, I suspect, the agents who are currently sitting in their car at the gate filling out paperwork. Thomas looked at the phone, then at the door. Panic, raw and animalistic, took over. He bolted. He shoved Julian aside and ran for the French doors leading to the garden. He burst out into the storm, scrambling over the wet patio stones. Let him go, Robert Carlyle said, not moving a muscle. The grounds are surrounded. The FBI doesn't just send 2 agents for a case this big. Sure enough, moments later, floodlights from the lawn illuminated the figure of Thomas Sterling, running through the mud. A voice over a loudspeaker boomed. Federal agents, drop to your knees. Sarah watched through the rain-streaked glass as Thomas was tackled into the mud of the rose garden, Daniel's favorite garden. She ended the live stream. The room was quiet again. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving Sarah feeling hollowed out. It's over, Christopher breathed, sinking onto the sofa. It's actually over. The rot is gone, Robert agreed. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and fear. I must say, Miss Miller, I have been practicing law for 45 years. I have never seen a maneuver like that. I improvised, Sarah said. She felt her legs give way, and she sat heavily on the window seat. What happens now? Julian asked timidly. Sarah looked at the cousins. She looked at the house, this massive, beautiful, cursed house. Now, Sarah said, we clean up the mess. The storm that had raged over Greenwich finally broke the morning after the arrests, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and weak, watery sunlight. But while the meteorological storm had passed, the media hurricane was just making landfall. By 8 a.m., the gates of the Kensington estate were barricaded by news vans, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. They were all there. The headline was irresistible. The Black Widow of Wall Street, Eleanor Kensington, arrested for multi-million-dollar fraud. And right alongside it, the subplot that had captivated the internet. The secret tech heiress who took down a dynasty. Sarah watched the circus from the master bedroom window. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night in the guest wing, but at 4 a.m., she had wandered into Daniel's room. It smelled like cedar and his cologne, a scent that made her knees weak and her heart ache. Miss Miller? Sarah turned. It was Maria, the maid. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she held a tray with coffee and toast. Thank you, Maria, Sarah said. Please, just call me Sarah, and you don't have to serve me. I know you haven't been paid in 2 months. Maria set the tray down on the heavy oak dresser. Mr. Carlyle wired our back pay this morning, with interest. He said it came from your personal account. Sarah nodded. I couldn't let you all suffer for Eleanor's greed. Maria hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged Sarah. It was a breach of protocol that would have given Eleanor a stroke, but Sarah melted into it. Thank you, Maria whispered. He was a good man, Mr. Daniel. He was the only one who asked about my kids. I'm glad you were the one to fight for him. Later that morning, Robert Carlyle arrived. He looked as tired as Sarah felt, his immaculate suit rumpled. They met in the sunroom, the only room in the house that didn't feel oppressive. The arraignment is set for Tuesday, Robert said, opening a fresh file. Bail has been denied. The flight risk is too high, given the offshore accounts we uncovered. And Thomas? Sarah asked, sipping her black coffee. Singing like a canary, Robert replied grimly. He's trying to cut a deal. He's giving the feds everything ledger dates, complicit board members, even the bankers who looked the other way. Kensington Logistics is going to be dismantled. The stock has already plummeted 90% overnight. Let it burn, Sarah said quietly. It was built on rot. There is the matter of the assets, Robert said, adjusting his glasses. The creditors are circling. Technically, you own the debt, so you have first claim on the house and the remaining liquid assets. but the lawsuits will be endless. The investors Thomas defrauded will come after the estate. Sarah looked out at the sprawling lawn where the FBI had tackled Thomas just hours before. I don't care about the money, Robert. Use the remaining assets to pay back the small investors first. The pension funds. The little guys. If there's anything left after that, give it to the staff as severance. And the house? Robert asked. It's a historic landmark, but the upkeep is $50,000 a month. Sarah looked at Christopher, who had just walked into the room. He was carrying a guitar case and a duffel bag. I'm moving into the carriage house, Christopher said, looking more alive than he had in years. I'm going to turn it into a recording studio, but the main house, it's too big, too many ghosts. Sarah nodded. An idea was forming. Robert, don't sell the house. Not yet. I have a plan for it. The following weeks were a blur of depositions and court appearances. Sarah had to sit in the front row of the federal courthouse in New Haven and watch Eleanor Kensington shuffle in wearing an orange jumpsuit. The once mighty matriarch looked small, shriveled. Her hair was gray and lank, stripped of its dye and styling. When the judge read the charges, 18 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of tax evasion, conspiracy to commit money laundering. Eleanor didn't cry. She just stared at the table. But as she was being led out, her eyes found Sarah's. There was no fire left in them, just a hollow, confusing mixture of hatred and begging. She mouthed one word, why? Sarah didn't look away. She stood up and mouthed back. For him, the hardest part wasn't the legal battle, it was the social one. The friends of the Kensington family, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the high society elite who had snubbed Sarah at the funeral, suddenly developed amnesia. Invitations to galas began arriving at the estate, addressed to Miss Sarah Miller. Flowers arrived. Apology notes from people who had whispered about her cheap shoes only weeks ago. Sarah burned them all in the library fireplace. They don't care about me, Sarah told Christopher one evening, as they sat on the floor of the empty library, eating pizza out of the box. They just care that I have the Kestrel money. I'm not the waitress anymore. I'm the eccentric tech genius. It's disgusting. It's their language, Christopher said, strumming a melancholy chord on his acoustic guitar. They only speak currency. You just happen to have the biggest wallet in the room now. I hate it, Sarah said. I miss my life. I miss being anonymous. I miss Daniel coming to my apartment and complaining about the leaky faucet. We were happy there, Chris. We were so happy. I know, Christopher said softly. He told me once that your apartment was the only place he felt he could breathe. The cousins, Julian and Pierce, had surprisingly taken Sarah's advice. Perhaps out of fear of prosecution, or perhaps because the reality of poverty had finally hit them, they had applied for warehouse jobs. Sarah received a text from Julian 3 weeks later. It was a photo of him wearing a high-visibility vest, looking exhausted but strangely proud. The caption read, "My feet are killing me, but I bought my own beer tonight. It tastes better." It was a small victory, but Sarah took it. 3 months passed. The snow came and went. The legal dust began to settle. Eleanor pled guilty to avoid a public trial that would have humiliated her further. She was sentenced to 12 years in a minimum security federal prison. Thomas Sterling got 15 years. Sarah visited Daniel's grave every Sunday. She always brought a white rose. The paparazzi had eventually gotten bored and moved on to the next scandal, leaving her in peace. But there was one final secret the house was holding. It happened in late February. Sarah was overseeing the movers who were clearing out Eleanor's hoarding in the attic. The old woman had kept everything, every receipt, every letter, every scrap of power she could cling to. "Miss Miller," one of the movers called out, "we found a loose floorboard behind the vanity. There's a box in there." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She climbed over a stack of dusty hat boxes. The mover handed her a small, velvet-covered box. It wasn't jewelry. It was a shoebox, taped shut. Written on the top, in Daniel's handwriting, was, "For Sarah, open only when I'm free." Sarah's hands trembled so hard, she almost dropped it. She dismissed the movers, sitting alone in the dust of the attic. She cut the tape with her house key. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't codes or ledgers. It was a stack of architectural drawings and a ring. The ring was modest, a vintage sapphire, not a diamond. It was exactly the kind of ring Sarah had pointed out in an antique shop window 2 years ago, telling Daniel she preferred it over the gaudy rocks his mother wore. He had remembered. She unfolded the drawings. They were blueprints. Daniel had designed a house, not a mansion, a cottage, a simple, solar-powered home on a piece of land in Vermont. There was a note attached. Sarah, if you're reading this, I finally got out. Either I stood up to her, or, well, I hope I stood up to her. I bought the land in Vermont 6 months ago. It's in your name. I've been siphoning my own trust fund, the clean part to build it. I want to grow old with you there. No servants, no galas, just us. I love you more than this family, more than this money, more than life. Marry me? Sarah curled into a ball on the attic floor, clutching the blueprints and the ring to her chest, and finally, truly, let go of the grief she had been holding back. She sobbed until her throat was raw, mourning the future that was stolen from them, but cherishing the proof that his love had been real. He had a plan. He was going to leave. He chose her. 1 year later, the gates of the Kensington estate were open. The menacing iron spikes that used to ward off the common folk had been removed, replaced by welcoming signage. The sign read, "The Kensington Center for Youth Arts and Technology." Sarah stood on the front steps, cutting the red ribbon. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair tied back. Next to her stood Christopher, who was now the director of the music program. The driveway was filled not with limousines, but with school buses. Children from the inner-city districts of Bridgeport and New Haven were streaming onto the lawn, carrying violins, coding laptops, and painting easels. Sarah had kept her promise. She hadn't sold the house. She had transformed it. The ballroom where Eleanor used to host her fraudulent galas was now a coding boot camp for underprivileged teens. The wine cellar was a dark room for photography students. The formal dining room was a cafeteria that served free, healthy meals. "You look nervous," Robert Carlyle said, stepping up beside her. The old lawyer had retired from his firm to act as the legal counsel for the nonprofit. He looked 10 years younger, without the weight of Eleanor's schemes on his shoulders. "I'm not nervous," Sarah smiled, watching a group of kids chasing each other around the fountain. "I'm just relieved. It finally feels like the house can breathe." "You gave away the fortune," Robert reminded her gently. "Between the restitution to the investors and the endowment for this center, you've effectively drained the Kestrel accounts and the Kensington assets. You're not a multi-millionaire anymore, Sarah." "I kept enough," Sarah shrugged. "I have enough for a comfortable life. I don't need $40 million to be happy. I learned that lesson the hard way." "And the Vermont property?" Robert asked. Sarah touched the sapphire ring on her right hand. She wore it every day. "The foundation is poured. Construction starts next month. I'll be splitting my time. Chris can handle the center." Christopher walked over, holding a microphone. "They want a speech, Sarah." Sarah stepped up to the podium. The crowd of donors, teachers, and students quieted down. She looked out at the sea of faces. She didn't see judgment anymore. She saw hope. "When I first came to this house," Sarah began, her voice projecting clear and strong, "I was told I didn't belong. I was told that worth is measured in bank accounts and bloodlines. I was told I was a gold digger." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd who knew the story. "But the man who lived here, Daniel Kensington, knew the truth," she continued. "He knew that gold is cold, it's heavy, and it doesn't love you back. The real wealth is what you build for others. This house used to be a fortress of secrets. Now, it's a factory of dreams. Daniel couldn't save himself from the weight of this legacy, but today, his legacy saves all of you." She looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, cloudless blue. "This is for Daniel," she whispered. As the applause broke out and the band led by Christopher started playing a jazzy, upbeat number, Sarah slipped away from the main crowd. She walked to the edge of the property, to the small, private cemetery. The grass was green and lush. Daniel's headstone was clean, the marble shining. But there was another change. Next to Daniel's grave, there was a small, flat marker. It wasn't a grave. Eleanor was still alive in prison, but it was a memorial stone for the idea of the Kensingtons. Sarah knelt down. She placed a single white rose on the earth. "I did it, Daniel," she spoke to the wind. "I fixed it. Mom is where she can't hurt anyone. Chris is happy. The cousins are well. They're working on it. And the house is full of noise and life." She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun. For the first time since the accident, she didn't feel the crushing weight of grief. She felt a lightness. She remembered the blueprints in the attic, the solar house in Vermont. "I'm going home now, Daniel," she said. "To our home." Sarah stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and turned back toward the mansion. She didn't look back at the graves. She looked forward, toward the music, toward the laughter of the children, and toward a future that she had built with her own two hands, not with gold, but with the iron will of a woman who refused to let a lie become the truth. She walked back into the light, leaving the shadows of the Kensingtons behind her forever. In the end, Eleanor Kensington learned the hardest lesson of all. You can paint over rust, but you can't paint over rot. She spent her life worshiping a name and a bank balance, willing to sacrifice her own son to maintain an illusion. She called Sarah a gold digger, projecting her own greed onto the only person who actually understood the value of love. Sarah proved that true power isn't about hoarding wealth. It's about having the integrity to use it for good. She didn't just inherit a fortune, she inherited a tragedy and turned it into a triumph. Daniel couldn't survive the toxicity of his family, but his memory became the seed for something beautiful. It's a stark reminder that when we die, nobody cares about the brand of our shoes or the size of our estate. They care about how we treated people. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps get these stories out to more people. And I want to know what you think. Do you think Sarah was right to give away the fortune, or should she have kept it for herself after everything she went through? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a new drama coming next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching.